It's an absolute pleasure, Karen. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Rachel. I'm afraid there's no Father Christmas outfit today, but maybe another time soon. Thank you, Joanna, for hosting. Thank you to everyone else who's involved. We've been talking about breakfast, and you mentioned hospitality there, Karen. I think one key theme I'll come back to during this talk is care and hospitality for oneself. Hospitality is something we do for other people, but it is also something we can do for ourselves. And food is looking after ourselves. Part of I think doing well in any sphere of life is about how we're set up, how our minds, how our bodies are set up, and food is culture as well. You'd expect me to say that working in a school of modern languages and culture, and in the research literature on PGR study, the culture, the environment in which one works is absolutely highlighted as fundamental to the success or failure of a PGR project. So pay attention to how you are, how you feel, how you're nourished in literal and figurative ways, and that, as I say, will help you get set up. I'm going to start with something I've never tried before. Presentations and talks are also research in a way. I'm going to put a couple of mentees in the chat. I've done mentees and Mentimeters before in person, but I've never tried it hybrid or entirely virtual as we are today. So with any luck, you've got two links in the chat to two different Mentimeter questions, just to get us started, just to help me understand who's in the room and what your views are. So number one, what motivates you to do a PhD? You should be able to put some words in there, and I should be able to generate the results. And number two, what do you want to do after your PhD? I'm going to come back to both of those themes throughout the day, and I'll talk about my own personal experiences as part of that. But just to get us started, just see if you can get into the links there and give some answers. And if you have any problems with it, my apologies, let me know, and I'll see if I can fix any issues that you've got. It looks like it's working so far. Karen, I can see you nodding. That's reassuring. All right. Good. Thank you. All right. And you can be candid. Obviously, we're looking for the language to be polite and objective and constructive, but you can be candid. I think one of the things I find working in, well, any workplace is, we use professional language. That doesn't mean we have to kind of hold back and, not pretend that there aren't problems and issues. And at the same time, some of the, I think, most effective people in the workplace are doing that, find a language which is objective and, is hospitable. You can be critical and hospitable in your language. So maybe just another few seconds to give you some time to give some responses there, and then I'll see if I can open them up and share them with you. Okay, so we've got a word cloud being generated here. Let me see if I can bring them both up at the same time. Okay, this is working suspiciously well. I'm a little slow, as you can tell, but it does seem to be working, so bear with me.
I've made you co-host, so hopefully if you want to share anything, that will be fine as well, Stephen.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. Okay, so I'm going to try that share screen now. Just going over here. So with any luck, you should be able to see the responses to what motivates you to do a PhD. And I'm seeing these fresh as you are. Can you all see them? Karen, can you see them? You're my sort of bellwether here. Okay, good. I've got a thumbs up from Joanna as well. So enriching experience, skills, passion, interest, job prospects, fear of failure, furthering knowledge, capability, challenge. Yes, fancy being a doctor. I mean, it's a stereotype, but it's true. The number of people that quite rightly get the PhD and then go out and change credit cards, ID cards, the rest of it. Avoiding getting a job. Yes, there's something to be said here for actually, university is a special place where, this is a job, but you can do something which is a bit out of the ordinary. Satisfaction, ambition, funding, so on and so forth. I'll make sure we can save that and send it on, as it might be useful to you. And let me try and pick out the other one. Where's that gone? So we've got, what do you want to do after PhD? Let me try and organize the screen there. So education, not academia. We'll come back to not academia. A lot of people are not going into academia. A lot of people do want to academia, and a fair number of people do, though obviously not everybody. Heritage, yes, cultural heritage, education sectors are increasingly open to PhDs. Publishing, teach, be happy, absolutely. Some of the work I've done on Dadaism and avant-garde experimental art movements has taken me into Buddhism, and I guess one of the tenets of Buddhism is to be happy almost in any circumstance, which sounds sort of potentially offensive or counterintuitive, but I'll be talking a little bit about different forms of happiness and how we might produce it. Good. I don't know what NED is, NED. If anyone wants to comment on the chat, then please come in. Yeah, be paid and be stable. We'll come back to that as well. All right, thank you very much for sharing so usefully there. So I will get those sent around as we go. Let me go in now to the slides for today, and I'll talk these through. There's a lot in some of these slides. They are rather heavy at times, and I won't try to be exhaustive with the data in some of them. I will get them sent around so you can digest them at your length. Karen, Joanna, can you see the front page of my presentation here? Okay, so we've got the thesis on the left, and I dug mine out, and I'm going to be thinking back to when it was just an idea and how horrible and difficult it was at various times, and how I got through that and how other people helped me through it. On the right is the paper from one of the last graduations I went to. It's an extraordinary event at the University of Glasgow, and in the middle is a symbol really of, well, it's a symbol of my thesis and a symbol of the kind of ethics that have come out of working on the thesis. It's a surrealist object in the middle here. It's a Buddhist Napoleon. The surrealists like putting together things that don't generally go together, and Buddhism and Napoleon as a military sort of conqueror often a conqueror, not always a conqueror, don't tend to go together. But it's about peaceful self-assertiveness. This image, you know, you can kind of peacefully self-assert yourself. And that's something that I like in the work I've done, and that speaks to me as I work through the Dada and the surrealism. So let's move on. I think universities are magic places. Yes, we are learning a lot about institutional violence in universities and other workplaces. We're learning about racism, historic and current. We're learning about gender-based violence and other forms of inequality and prejudice, and it's absolutely right that we have those conversations and learn from them and be honest about them. I think intellectually as well, universities are magic places. They are places where you can study, you research, you can be curious, you can capture some of those values that you've already brought out in the responses to the Menti. Last calendar year, there was an education minister standing off in the press about how we needed more people doing engineering degrees and fewer people doing Harry Potter degrees. And I got cross about that, not particularly because I work in the School of Languages, but because I don't like these sort of either or conflicts. And it also seems to me that all the time we are blending together subjects in ways that actually go against that kind of a statement. And what better example of how engineering and magic and myth and imagination can come together than the Gilbert Scott building, just a few meters from where we work. So universities are places where subjects, interest, specialisms can and must blend and converge and synthesize. And this is not just some sort of ideological whim or fantasy on my part. This is about the future direction of travel for UK research, for so-called impactful research, about which I'll say a bit more. And I think blending and making friends with other specialisms, being hospitable to other expertise, is something that has certainly helped me develop from quite a narrow focus in my PhD, and it's something that I would encourage anyone to think about in their research career. That kind of that magic that can happen. It can take some time to find it, but it can happen when you speak to someone maybe from a completely different subject area, or perhaps from someone who's just next door to you. Okay, so now we're getting a bit heavy. I don't think Kay is on the call, but Kay Guccione is our head of research culture and research and development, and she's done some work that I found very interesting. She was talking or looking with a colleague at how students who've done a PhD value the PhD, and the difference between the terms the PhD is worth doing and the PhD is worth having. And Kay and Billy Bryan's study found that the circumstances of the current employment are the most common predictor of the overall perceived value of the PhD, and that those who reported that doctorates were not worth doing attributed this to a lack of positive career outcome. So an obvious thing to say, but how you look back on the PhD, the extent to which you feel it's worth doing, will obviously relate significantly to what you're able to do or not able to do with it afterwards. So worth doing for the value it conveys to these students personally, but in some cases not worth having because of its low value or perceived low value to employers. And Kay and Billy Bryan here are calling for further focus on non-academic careers in doctoral education, and also further work to understand how non-academic employers recruit, motivate and value doctoral studies. And you've got the links to the different articles in these presentations as we go. Yes, Joanne. Yes, she's on holiday, isn't she, this week? Yeah, but absolutely look at the work. This is serious and interesting stuff, and it can help you along the way. So a few more kind of careers and numbers around PhDs. Career paths are increasingly varied, as we say. The number of PhDs internationally has exploded. I still think that means you are doing something magic. And in some ways, I think it's a sign of perhaps a progressing society, an enlightened and a self-enlightening society, that there is now so much doctoral research going on. Nonetheless, you are still in the tiny majority of the population. I think it's under 1% in the UK of people aged 25 to 65 who are doing a PhD. So you're in a tiny minority doing something very special. You are making new knowledge. You are making new knowledge that's publishable in whole or in part. 67% or so of PhD students want a career in academic research, according to HEPI, but about 30% stay on in academia 3 years on. And I'll come back to some more detailed statistics in a minute that perhaps allows you to understand how things look in your particular area, because I understand we've got PGRs on the call from across the 4 different colleges, and of course the picture is more nuanced the more you drill down. In terms of sectors of employment, I was interested to see that there are very large variations across different countries. So depending on the country that you move to after the UK, if you don't stay in the UK, the landscape for employment and for life after the PhD may vary quite considerably. In some countries, quite a lot of doctorate holders are going into the business sector. Others higher education and government as well, and you certainly see this, I think, in the UK increasingly, that you hear in the news that Dr. so-and-so has been advising ministers, or even is a minister within the civil service, or Caroline Lucas would be someone who I believe has a PhD in English literature, who is a kind of major figure within UK politics. So essentially the door is opened very widely to a wide range of careers, but the context will vary greatly from one country to the next. Career destinations. So this is the slide that I thought might be especially useful for this kind of an audience. I'll just give you a minute to perhaps locate yourself on that. So these headings don't map exactly onto our colleges, but in many ways they kind of do. So you've got arts and humanities, biological sciences, biomedical sciences, including health, physical science and engineering, social sciences, and so on. So you can see some relative stability between those figures, but also some quite significant variations. Again, that may help to kind of give an idea of where people in your kind of position, you're doing a PGR project in your field or your general field, are ending up. So you can see that although a fair number in each category do end up working in higher education, a considerable number do not as well. And I would say that it's increasingly common for people with a PhD to end up in a university, but perhaps not be teaching or lecturing per se. We have a lot of very able people who've done PhDs working in university services departments, university professional departments of one sort or another. And I know several people who have actually made a conscious choice to end up working in that kind of area rather than going into a standard teaching and research lectureship. Again, just a few points on the current and future directions for PhDs generally. The press is mentioning that the various post-1992 institutions and vocational institutions are increasingly securing the right to award PhDs. So that's kind of one direction of travel for policy and awarding around PhDs. Professional doctorates are expanding quite significantly. As a major pilot, as an example, in the Netherlands, where 36 or so universities are piloting professional doctorates connected to challenges of one sort or another, health challenges, climate emergencies, economic and social issues, and so on and so forth. And you may have heard this word impact. I've mentioned it at least once so far on the call today. There is a very clear expectation from UK government and from UK research and innovation, who fund UK research, including funded PGRs, that funded research must be excellent. So the quality must be very strong. We must be doing original significant work. It must be robust and rigorous, but it must also be impactful. And this is not something which is only relative to I don't know, people working in civic engineering or the health sciences. This is absolutely germane really to all of us now. It's not to say that we can't and shouldn't do very abstract blue skies research. I've heard pure mathematicians as well as analysts of obscure poetry like myself talk about the importance of being able to just be left alone and do abstract a certain amount of ivory tower research perhaps. But in terms of UK government and funding expectations, we are increasingly required to do research that is impactful. And impact, if I was to sum it up in a sentence, would be positive change outside the academy. So how is our research helping to produce evidence positive change outside of universities? And that's a lot easier for some of us to do than others. And I'll say a bit more about how I've gone about trying to convert a PhD on obscure experimental French poetry into something that's impactful outside of my own teaching. Because obviously teaching is extraordinarily impactful, but unfortunately the UK government doesn't consider teaching that we're doing within our own institution to count as impact per se. Okay, another busy slide, and then I'll be into some much smoother slides, but just on the UK context to understand where we are. So the UK remains outside the US the biggest destination for PhD students, as I understand it, but the UK position is shrinking. We're becoming more isolated. We are losing EU-based doctoral students. Inevitably, as you would expect me to say, I think there's a lot of evidence that Brexit is a factor in that. Other countries are very much on the rise and are sort of pumping a lot of support of one sort or another into PhD study. So the UK's market share of international doctoral numbers has fallen somewhat. Interesting stats here about self-funding. So a growing number of people, within the expansion of PhD study generally are self-funding. And many more PhD students in the UK are living abroad. So there's a lot more remote and hybrid study going on. Again, just to help kind of locate yourself within a national context. I hope that might be at least useful. Okay, let me just whiz into the chat, make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes, GTAs. I'm going to come back to GTAs in a bit. It is amazing. It can be difficult. You need to know your rights and your responsibilities as a GTA, but it can and should be amazing. And I'll talk a little bit about my own experience in that area as we go. Okay, so this is the chance where I get to sort of gratuitously waffle on about my own, avuncular nostalgia. I'll try not to be too sort of, Werther's original about this. I did my PhD 1999 to 2002. I went from a very happy undergraduate and master's time at Warwick University down to Wadham College in Oxford to write my PhD, where I was also very happy. But about 3 months into the thesis in the library space that you can see on the left here, I was pretty convinced that I didn't have a PhD in me and that there wasn't a PhD in the material. That wasn't, kind of self-pitying, though I did feel very worried about the whole thing. But I thought, I've managed to sort of crack the recipe of doing undergraduate essays and got through a master's, but this is something different, and I need to adapt, and I'm not sure how to do that. I was blessed with an astonishing supervisor who is not only phenomenally intelligent and erudite, but also just very enthusiastic for the material. So if you've got that kind of person when you're struggling, great. If you haven't, there are those people around, and there are so many layers of support one way and another. A key message for me about getting through PhD life is talk to people, find people, find the help that works for you. And I'll come back to saying some examples about what that means later on. I finished the PhD once I got into the groove with it and understood that it wasn't an undergraduate essay I was writing, but was something rather different, where I needed to assert my own voice, be clear about what my research questions were, and produce new knowledge, and actually, just generate that sense of fizz and excitement for the material. Then I was into a much better groove with it, and I found a culture. I found a group of people that I like to talk to about work, informally. I started doing conference papers, and it generated its own sense of momentum. And a few years after I finished the PhD, I was able to publish the PhD as the book cover that you see in front of you. And that still feels a bit unreal. I still have dreams about not having finished the PhD. That may be a common dream to have. And I think part of the point of the dream is to produce the relief and the pleasure on sort of waking up that this thing that sits over you and is not done for so long can be done, and you can do it, and you will do it. But it can be very tough, as I say. Let's go on to the next slide. I did all the usual sorts of things that people in your kind of position will do, I think. I had temporary jobs after the PhD. I did some GTA style teaching, and I'll say more about that in a second. I had 3 different temporary jobs over 3 different years before I was lucky enough to get a permanent job at the University of Birmingham. And I was starting to think by that point, maybe I've just sort of peaked, and maybe I'm close to a permanent job, because I was getting interviews, but I wasn't getting the interview success. And I was starting to think, well, what are the other sectors? I mean, this is a very different environment. This is 20 years ago. I think things have got different, and in some ways more challenging for your cohort and your generation than they were for me. But as I say, I did 9 months here, 10 months there, and it was tough moving around different bits of the country. I remember one experience having an interview, and I realized that the chair of the interview panel had drifted off to sleep at the other end of the table. And you can see here a sort of an image from that interview as I look back on it. So there are these sort of horror stories out there, and as I say, I've been through some of these experiences myself. I think a crucial thing to do is to keep in touch with your mentors, and we say this and we mean it, that when you finish your PhD, you must stay in touch with us, and you must stay in touch with us for mentoring. And I think it's probably more that is being done, but more that could be done as well, to support our PGRs once they've left us, and to, for us to kind of maybe formalize that support a bit more, and be maybe more clear with PGRs about what they can get from us once they've finished. There's a lot of that informally going on as well. Okay, so yeah, I worked in different aspects of surrealist research. Some images here bringing together different parts of the surrealist universe. These are all images from things that I've taught along the way, and it's it's a wonderful and a wild, wacky universe. So I was basically doing film studies, art history, cultural analysis of different sorts in my research and my teaching. That was wonderful. And I'm also a language teacher, and people in the chat have already mentioned the thrill of teaching and how satisfying it is, and I can't endorse that strongly enough. There's this old cliche that we remember more of what we teach than in any other mode, so compared to reading or listening to something, if we teach something, then we really kind of learn it. I can speak to that very, I think, authentically, having spent a lot of my early teaching career saying to students, I don't know the answer to that question, or I do know the answer to that question, but I can't explain to you why the answer is that way. And you see here a quip, thank you for your careful checking. Your students are kind of kind, and they'll give you things like, I got a card and a nice sort of surrealist book from the first group of language students I ever taught. It was a kind of 1 hour thing to help them reinforce their French grammar. And it says, thank you for your careful checking in the front of this book. And I've still got it up on the shelf. And, if you go into any member of staff's, kind of office, there are these cards around, these thank you cards, and you build up these working relationships with students, and you stay in touch with them over, many years. The longer you go through this profession, you see them develop, they stay in touch with you, and it really is, the most satisfying part of the job. It is tough. It's tough to learn marking criteria, to apply them. It's tough to get through the work. It's a lot of hours. Sometimes, students aren't happy with the grade you've given them, and that's part of the pedagogical experience as well. But it all leads to graduation, that photo on the top right there of the screen. So I'm a teacher as well as a researcher. And, some of you will be teaching already. Others of you might be considering it. I would strongly encourage you to find a way of trying to make it work with your research. Take advice from your supervisors, as you're encouraged to do. But it's, a wonderful part of what we do, and it is impact, despite what the government have to say. Okay, so, we've talked about outstanding originality, significance, rigor, and in cultural terms, I can't go beyond the rock band Queen, my all-time favorites. There was a point where I thought, well, I love this PhD, but I'm several years beyond it now. I want to break free from the PhD. I want to do something different. And I came back to that thought that I think is the title of some self-help book that I haven't read, but the title stuck in my mind. And the phrase is, what got you here won't get you there. And it, to me, encapsulates this idea that we need to take stock every so often and evolve and think about, well, rather than me just sort of pumping out yet another chapter, kind of 5-10 years after my PhD, which is basically a kind of a very linear evolution of the PhD. Why don't I do something different? Why don't I do something kind of radical or new? So for the last 10 or so years, I've been casting around looking for opportunities to do that. And I wanted to say something about this by way of exemplifying to you ways in which, you might cast around and set up new connections and think about, when is the right moment for you to not exactly break free, or you might want to break free, but to, to change, to evolve, to remodulate your research and what you do. So I felt that, it's a case of, for me, so move away from the PhD, do something different. And I started to think about how is it that the principles of the artwork that I work on, how can we, apply them to real world problems? How can I use them to talk to other people, whether it's, friendship, humor, albeit in very homosocial groups, as in the surrealist group bottom left, whether it's the combination of the everyday and the luxurious, as in this wonderful sort of wheelbarrow here, whether it's abstraction, whether it's provocation, as in the Berlin Dada Museum exhibition from the 1920s. How can I apply those principles in new contexts? How can I use these Dada surrealist conjunctions in new ways? And a few examples of those conjunctions and juxtapositions here, just to kind of bring this to life. So this is a very humorous 1970s piece on the top left, entitled Freud Discovering the Phallus. So the idea of, a certain amount of humor around sexuality and desire, but also recognizing the violence, the strangeness of desire, and also juxtapositions, putting things together that don't kind of go together, but are sort of compelling in some way, so juxtapositions that are absurd, but also compelling and functional. And I started to notice that there were, echoes and spirits of Dada all around us in the modern age. So, Pussy Riot, top left, doing very brave and iconoclastic, works of art, of culture, of protest against Orthodox Church, against Russian government, or against Russian politicians, and so on and so forth. And this is dangerous for these people, as it was for some of the Berlin Dadaists, particularly in the 1920s. Bottom left, you've got clowning and play and humor and stupidity being used to enforce road traffic laws. This is in Colombia in the 1990s. and it was much more effective than using standard police officers. And then bottom right as well, you know, the protester offering probably muguet to French police officers. I started to notice that there's something going on to do with experimental and playful forms of protest. So some form of protest is to kind of go out and start throwing bricks, you know, banks and police and so on and so forth. But there are other forms of protest out there that are interested in, you know, kind of more playful or ludic or even, you know, loving modes. So I started to kind of look around for these sorts of connections. A few more examples on the slide, and I started to find them everywhere. So, you know, it sounds absurd, but Bruce Dickinson of the metal band Iron Maiden going out into you know, a war zone during the Bosnian War to do theatre, to do performance, and to spread hospitality, to spread affinity and friendship. The Clowns traffic law project I've mentioned, but this bottom right image as well really sort of sticks out. So this is Dada and Surrealism without the Dada and Surrealism. This image on the bottom right has no formal connection to Dada Surrealism, but it's about, you know, playfully subverting authority. So this is on the US-Mexico border, the site of the hateful, you know, metal structure that has gone up to keep people apart. And an art organization stuck some, you know, nice pink seesaws through this wall, and people who can't be together because of the wall were able to play together. It was up there for about 20 minutes, you know, kind of fleeting, you know, transitory, you know, kind of playful thing that is both a toy and a gesture, you know, a gesture of defiance back in different directions. And just again on the protest, you know, if you're interested in this kind of avenue, look up the work of Larry Bogad. He's a US academic practitioner, you know, using play to perhaps encourage, you know, democracy in voting, for instance, or to find other ways of, you know, protesting, you know, so throwing kisses, for example, rather than bricks. And this is experimental, you know, this is experimental, this is research. So I had a chance encounter with an anthropologist as all of this stuff was sort of floating around my head. And she does work in West Africa, particularly Sierra Leone. And we came up with a project that got some Global Challenges research funding, and it sounded wacky and a bit nuts. But the idea was that we would work with an NGO to which we already had contacts through the anthropologist. And whereas the NGO normally goes into communities and talks to them about gender-based violence and the laws around gender-based violence, in this case, we would use comedians. And our starting point really was as a relationship between human violence, and that this is uncomfortable, but this is true, that sometimes violence is done because people find it enjoyable. Sometimes people do violence because they find it amusing. And of course, people who experience trauma often find themselves laughing or using humor after it to process it, to understand it, to articulate it. So we ran this project of over around 10 days in a local community in Sierra Leone, and we used professional comedians. You can see the McKinney comedians on the screen here. And we use this as a starting point to talk about, you know, early marriage, rape, teenage pregnancy, economic violence, poverty. We use this as a way to get a conversation going. And it worked. It wasn't perfect. It was problematic in some ways. And that was part of the research, you know, kind of question. How do we work that through? How do we mitigate the imperfections? But it was one of the most, you know, kind of exciting and I think creatively daring things I've been involved in. And we've managed to secure some more sizable funding for it afterwards. And I think that has a lot to do not only with the kind of the impactful nature of the work, but also it kind of catches the eye. You know, I've gone for loads of grant applications over the years, asking for, you know, very small sums of money to do, you know, pretty standard stuff that's more of this. And I would have churned out some articles, maybe the odd book, and it would have been fine. But it didn't catch the eye of the funders. Whereas, you know, something that brings in unexpected partners and maybe tries to, you know, aspires to some of that kind of sparkiness that I referred to earlier between disciplines, that is perhaps more likely to catch the eye. And here you can see again, you know, just a slide where the performers are, they're creating what we call the vicinity of laughter. They're creating a space where it's okay to laugh, and people are being laughed with rather than being laughed at. And I'm interested on the sideline as well about some of the neuroscience research on the authenticity of laughter and how it is that we, you know, we create authenticity and laughter through creating certain kinds of spaces. So, come a long way from home since thinking about obscure French poetry, although that is still kind of within what I do. But as I say, by dint of breaking free of the PhD, by dint of thinking, well, it's time to change up or just change, and trying to be open to new possibilities and giving that process patience, I've generated new partnerships, and we got the HRC grant 150k or so for the SGBV project that I mentioned there. And I've also got a new project on the go, facilitated really by the openness of the University of Glasgow to putting people together for conversations that may go somewhere or may not go somewhere. So a couple of years ago, we had one of these, kind of get to know you conversations with people from psychology and neuroscience. Got to know Professor Frank Pollock on that call and his group of postdocs and PGRs. And we got a relatively small pot to do a pilot project on surrealism and neuroscience. And that is happening as we speak. We're generating the first sets of data there with our first participants. How far will it go? We don't know. But again, because there's a structure that helps me to talk to people and get to know people and say, well, what about this? I've always thought it'd be interesting to see what an fMRI response to surrealist movies actually is, and then I meet someone who says, yeah, we could do that. There's a kind of an open-mindedness to trying it that has helped answer those questions about breaking free and changing up in constructive ways. If you're interested, take a look at what we've written and see if it holds up to you. I'll put these slides around, as I say, so you can link through to them if you like. Publishing is thrilling. I mentioned this earlier, and while it's in my head, I'm going to come back to this. The first thing I ever published, I think, was a book review. And it's I keep saying the word magic, but it is sort of a bit unreal to see your name in print. If you haven't had that happen to you yet, it will come, and I thoroughly recommend it. But while this thought is also in my head, find ways of being nice, not only because that is professional and hospitable, and as I say, you can be nice and be critical, but also because you will probably meet some of the people whose work you're reviewing. You may bump into them at conferences, they may be on job panels, you may meet them. So, kind of bear that in mind. But, you've got the links to the things that we've put out so far on the SGBV project. And although the PhD is nowhere here, in other ways, I can still, of course, see where all this comes from in terms of the PhD. So, the Dada poetry that I wrote my thesis on was a response to the epic imperial and post-imperial violence of World War I and the interwar years, the collapse of the Weimar Republic, and so on and so forth. The avant-garde is intrinsically about inner life and bringing insight out. It's about dark humor, it's about doubt, aporia, playfulness, and so on and so forth. So those principles are still there, even though Dada poetry is nowhere named. Okay, so I'm going to try and whiz through the rest of the slides. I'm already conscious that I'm going to be quite close to 10:30, and Joanna or Karen or Rachel, if you want me to just sort of cut at any point, let me know. Or if you want to give me a kind of 2-minute warning, then I can do that. I appreciate that might be some questions afterwards. There's a code of practice for more or less everything, and if there isn't, there'll be someone somewhere who wants to write one for the right reasons. So my kind of key message here would be, you're in a named role as a PGR student, and if you're a GTA, you're in a separate named role as a GTA. There's a whole framework around that, and you may already know the codes of practice, you may already have looked at them, but if not, I would just kind of take some time, back to food and drink, looking after yourself, make time to just sort of carefully read it through. There may be no surprises there, but no bad thing to know, where you stand. And it looks as if every college has got a PGR handbook, so I would read in connection with that. A few specifics that sort of stuck out to me as I reviewed all this. So the student is responsible for the program of research, for collecting data, and so on and so forth. The supervisory team is there to provide guidance, but not leadership, interestingly, in the development of the student's thesis. Now, there's more text and more gloss than this, but as I say, worth just sort of reminding yourself where the responsibilities lie. This is really important. You might not know this. PGR students are entitled to take a maximum of 8 weeks annual leave. And I always encourage staff in my school to take annual leave as well. The arrangements will vary from one college to the next, but whether we're an elite musician, athlete, PGR student, whatever, rest is an absolute intrinsic part of improvement. No one improves by working 24/7. In some ways it's in the time of the rest that we repair, we recover, that the cells build back up from the sort of micro trauma that we've done to them. So the rest is really important for a whole host of reasons. And a full-time working week at the University of Glasgow is 35 hours. And I can't hear anyone on the call, but I imagine there's some laughter there. Again, as I say to the staff in the school, this should not just be some sort of joke that we kind of laugh about. This should be something that we aspire to. And as a rule, I don't work in the evenings, I don't work on weekends. And that is undoubtedly partly because I'm in a privileged position. I'm a head of school. I've done certain things in my career so far, and other people in other positions will have other obligations. Nonetheless, I think there's a lot to be said for how I try to kind of manage my own time and parameters that I set for myself. And as I say, a 35-hour working week is the aspiration. So the question is, what can the institution do for me, and how can I help myself, and how can we help each other to have a workload that is kind of manageable and comfortable. GTAs, I won't dwell on the code of practice here, but again, there is one, so worth looking at. As I say, the GTA role is separate from the status as a PGR in sort of formal terms, but of course there is an impact of the GTA work on the studies, kind of upwards and downwards. So sometimes you might think, well, I want to take on a bit more GTA work for the money. That's obviously a vital factor for a lot of people. It might also be for the experience that you want to generate, a bit more breadth of experience. Or you might say, well, actually, I need to kind of dial this down a bit, either for myself, my overall well-being, or for concentration on the thesis. Again, I won't dwell on that, but it's in the slides, and these were points that I thought would be worth picking at. They just sort of gloss the points about the responsibilities and the split between supervisors and PGRs themselves. Key point though at the bottom, if you are employed as a GTA, you must make sure you've got the appropriate induction. There'll be a line manager who's responsible for that. You should never just be kind of let loose without knowing what the arrangements for teaching are, or how it all hangs together. Yeah, and the human side. So back to Kay, mentioning that teaching provides researchers with the opportunity to contextualize and reinforce their knowledge. This was so important for me. I felt I was working on something that was so sort of niche that when I had to teach it, I had to, by definition, connect it to a wider universe, and that was very helpful. It certainly made me feel more confident in the classroom. I don't think I've kind of achieved total confidence, and I'm kind of suspicious of the idea of total confidence, because I think knowledge is by definition never complete, but nonetheless it will sort of build you up, and it builds up that sense of belonging, that sense of being part of a community of students who are kind of going somewhere and achieving things in life. That is absolutely true and fundamental. And I mentioned before all of those thank you cards that you'll see in people's offices, and teaching awards as well that exist to recognize people. That's all part of the energy of teaching. I haven't brought together advice so far in a single slide. I have tried to give different bits of advice as I've gone, but I wanted to list these as common themes in advice that I've given to PGRs, and I've heard given to PGRs. So an obvious one, where is the research question? And I had to kind of learn this for myself, as I said about my own PhD. Am I just writing an exploration and a kind of presentation of material, or am I researching that material? And as you write up your research material, new questions will emerge, and that can be a useful way of actually moving from one part of the thesis to the other. So you say, well, having done our early results and findings on X, Y, and Z, actually, this new set of questions emerges, and that's now giving new structure, a new momentum to this, subsequent part of the thesis, and it helps to generate that sense of drive that I've referred to earlier. Sometimes you'll find students who've done loads of really good reading about the research literature that exists already, but they don't make clear what their own position is in relation to that literature. So do you agree? Do you disagree? That's part of the transition from undergraduate to PhD study. Are you expanding the knowledge? Are you modifying it? Are you tearing it all up, throwing it in the bin and saying we need to start again with a completely new set of fundamentals and models? Joanna referred earlier to the 3-minute PhD. I never did this as a student. And I kind of think I should try and go through the exercise now. You'll always be asked, what do you do? What is your PhD? And this might be something informal down the cafe, or it could be a family occasion. Try to develop your own micro abstract whereby, very quickly, whether it's in a job interview or a kind of passing conversation, you can say to someone, well, this is what I do. They don't have to love it. They don't have to like it. But I think there's something to be said for feeling comfortable with a form of words that allows you to explain what you do. The APR seems to generate quite a lot of anxiety. It's a serious process, but it's absolutely intended, to be a supportive one. And it's about having, someone else who is an academic, but not necessarily a specific expert in your field, cast a pair of eyes over the work and give some advice, and gives you a chance to share the work and receive some comments and feedback. And it is also a chance to pick up problems. Most APRs go fine, but let's say a student has got an issue with a supervisor or the material or something that is an issue, then the APR is a serious chance for us to check in and make sure that everything is all right and that problems don't kind of linger till the very end. It was an eye-opener to me to actually look at some PhDs. I just went into the university library one day and looked at what a PhD looked like. That helped me kind of understand and get a line of sight onto what my PhD might look like. You can see them these days online. I mentioned the idea of meeting people whose work you might review. Conference paper, so kind of time for a rubbish joke. Doctor, I think I'm a conference paper. The doctor says, don't worry, it'll be over in 20 minutes. If it's not over in 20 minutes and you're on for a 20-minute paper, however outstanding your research is, some people will start to fidget and start to grumble. Advice given to me early on was, if you've got a 20-minute conference paper, time it to 19 minutes. There's nothing that's so essential that you have to kind of spill over into 25, 30 minutes. Whoever is in the room, whatever they think of your work, they'll love you for finishing on time, as will the organizers. So, don't do what I'm doing and massively kind of overrun. Time your work according to the slot you've been given once you are involved in conference papers. And as I said earlier, if it's a question, a problem, a crisis, ask for help. There are plenty of people around, and there are options. Sometimes students will switch from full-time or part-time or vice versa. There's the option to look at suspending studies and coming back if there's some major life event that needs taken care of, extensions, personal support, and so on and so forth. So, be well aware of all the options that are out there. Okay, I'll whiz through this and then I'll wrap up. There's more here than I could hope to capture, but when we research...
Yeah, Stephen, if you could rattle through, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I'll put this very, very succinctly. I realized that when I was reading this material about the avant-garde, that I was interested in this not only as a researcher, but as a person. So my hypothesis was this was a major art movement that has been misunderstood, that there's a lot of kind of ethics and Buddhism in this art movement, but also that was interesting to me as a person. So I've taken that forward into, kind of different ways of being. So again, it sounds very sort of pretentious perhaps, but I try to be kind of meditative. I try to pay attention to staying calm, to my breath, to how I'm feeling. And that can be very important because, 1 minute you'll come out of a kind of a thrilling teaching session. The next minute, a member of staff might arrive with a kind of serious life problem. You need to be ready to listen, to take in the information without, kind of becoming too upset oneself. So there's some material in here that might guide you. I've extrapolated this into some, kind of tips based on my field, but there'll be versions of this, for you. So, humor and laughter are serious ways of living. If you've received a nasty email, read it aloud in a silly voice. You get the content, but you kind of diffuse perhaps the nastiness of it, and so on and so forth. And then to conclude, I've mentioned various world-leading publications or the aspiration to that. A couple of slides that amuse me to finish. And so the PhD will inhabit you. It will drive you mad. This is from the satirical journal The Onion. about a PhD student who is so sort of consumed by his PhD on deconstruction that he deconstructing the takeout menu. So the PhD will consume you, but we mustn't lose sense of that or lose sight of that thrill. And this amused me as well. So, you know, scientist, oops, lost the slide. Where's it gone? A science researcher who thought that, you know, her job would be much less grant writing and more glow in the dark lizard making. I think that my kind of message to leave you with in typical sort of slightly surrealistic style would be, you know, the PhD can be all consuming. It is a all consuming life, but it is a life. It should be a life, and don't let go of the search for that glow in the dark lizard, whether literal or metaphorical. Thank you very much for listening. I'll gladly take questions now or afterwards, but good luck with the rest of the day, and good luck with your PhD thesis. We are all rooting for you, and we wish you all the best. Thanks, Joanna.